I think most everyone's here. We look like everyone has made it through. Thanks all for your cooperation with our security measures. We very much appreciate it. My name is Adam Rovner. I direct our Center for Judaic Studies. You may have heard me several times already pop up and say who I am and tell you various things. What I'm really here to do tonight is two things. One, to tell you that our Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Denver is really kicking off a milestone, and we're kicking off that milestone tonight. So you're here to witness the kickoff of our 50th anniversary celebration. That's no small achievement. Centers come and go. Our center is going from strength to strength. We have been around now and part of the fabric of the community in Denver and along the Front Range for several decades, and the Jubilee year is really something for us to be proud of and to spread the word about, and we hope that you will tell others, if you enjoy tonight's program, which I'm sure you will, to tell others to come to our programs and to see what it is that we are doing. And we're not going to solicit from you every time you come, so you don't have to worry about that, okay? And it's not even going to happen tonight. Tonight is about enjoying a lecture that is a talk, a roundtable that's going to bring us right up to date from 50 years ago to today. We're going to talk about the State of American Jewry. And we have with us a wonderful panel, and I'm going to let Josh introduce everyone. But for right now, I just wanted to let you know that on our 50th anniversary, guess what we did? We finally published an annual report. So it's really a half-century report. And I hope that you will take a look at it and see all the good work we've done, all about our phenomenal faculty, all our programming, and really most of all, which is why we do it, our students. So if you haven't picked one of these up, please do on your way out. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the Provost and Vice Chancellor of the University of Denver, a biomedical engineer, I am told also an inventor, and our new Provost who joins us from Southern Methodist University, now at the hockey powerhouse, the University of Denver. Please welcome Provost Elizabeth Loboa.
Thank you so much, Adam. And congratulations, the 51st annual report for the University of Denver Center for Judaic Studies. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the University of Denver and the 27th annual Livingston and Abrams Lecture in American Jewish History. The Livingston and Abrams Lecture is sponsored by the Rocky Mountain Jewish Historical Society and the University of Denver Center for Judaic Studies. This year, we are excited to present the Livingston and Abrams Lecture as the keynote program of this year's Western Jewish Studies Association Conference. And we are thrilled to host our colleagues from across the United States and around the world here for the WJSA conference. As Adam mentioned, this is the 50th anniversary. 2026 marks the 50th anniversary of the University of Denver Center for Judaic Studies and RMJHS. And tonight's special program kicks off a year during which we celebrate this singular milestone. DU Center is the fourth oldest academic unit dedicated to Jewish studies in the United States, and it is at the heart of our College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. This center exists to inspire generous curiosity, to cultivate intergenerational and multi-faith conversations, and to prepare our students for ethical leadership. At the University of Denver, our faculty and students are committed to tackling difficult questions and to engaging in dialogue across our differences to understand diverse viewpoints. And I would say now more than ever, such an incredibly important time to be doing that. DU was founded in 1864, before Colorado was even a state. Since its inception, our University of Denver has challenged the status quo and dedicated itself to the proposition that education should be open to all. In fact, DU offered its first Jewish studies course over a century ago in 1922, when Rabbi Charles E. H. Kavar taught rabbinic literature to our students. And I believe the Kavar family is in our audience tonight, at least Joanne and Ken. Would you please stand up so we can acknowledge you? At a time when I think we all can agree, the headlines, at least, for higher education are pretty grim. DU remains a bright light for the liberal arts and academic freedom. Tonight, I would like to honor two influential individuals who embody these commitments. The Livingston Lecture was established in 1999 in memory of Professor John Livingston, who taught at DU and was chair of the history department for decades. I also believe John's sister, Barbara Carpenter, is here. Are you here, Barbara? Would you please stand up and let us acknowledge you? Dr. John, as he was affectionately known, was a scholar of American social and intellectual history. He became interested in the American Jewish experience and was a founder and research director of the Rocky Mountain Jewish Historical Society and Ira M. Beck Archives. Without John's guiding influence, we would not be gathered here this evening. Though he passed away in 1999, he has left an enduring legacy. Tonight, we also remember John's beloved wife, Nancy Livingston, who passed away just in 2023. Nancy was a dedicated and accomplished educator whose career included more than 20 years as director of early childhood education at the Denver Jewish Community Center. I also want to express my gratitude to John and Nancy's daughter, Julie, and her husband, John. They can't be here tonight, but our very sincere gratitude for endowing this lecture so that our community can gather each year to learn from the best scholars, thinkers, and performers active in American Jewish life. Last year, this annual program was renamed the Livingston and Abrams Lecture in American Jewish History in recognition of Professor Jeannie Abrams. Jeannie, I know you were here. I chatted with you a little earlier. Would you please stand up? Jeannie Abrams. She retired just in 2024 after more than 4 decades at the helm of the Rocky Mountain Jewish Historical Society and the Beck Archives here at DU. It would be impossible to do justice to her many contributions in such a limited amount of time, but let me just say that in building up the Beck Archives and leading RMJHS for 42 years, she has done more than any other individual to document, preserve, and publicize the history of Jews in Colorado and the Rocky Mountain region. Please join me one more time in recognizing Dr. Jeannie Abrams and all of these amazing individuals. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Joshua Furman, the director of the Rocky Mountain Jewish Historical Society and who teaches American Jewish history for our DU Center for Judaic Studies. Joshua.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much, Provost Laboa, for that introduction. Thank you all so much for being here. I want to start by recognizing and thanking my incredible colleagues in our Center for Judaic Studies. You already heard from our director, Adam Rovner, but none of this would be possible without an incredibly dedicated staff team, Ingrid Weyer, Selena Namoff, our RMJHS project manager, Jordan Bennett, our student support from Flora Riley and Ryan Davis. I also want to thank our RMJHS board members who are here tonight. If you are an RMJHS board member, please stand so we can recognize you and thank you for your support of our organization. And of course, our generous donors who make programs like tonight's event possible. Tonight's program is the keynote event of the 2026 Western Jewish Studies Association Conference, which we at DU are very honored to host this year. The WJSA was founded in 1995. It hosts an annual conference in the Western United States for scholars in all fields of Jewish studies and provides a vital opportunity for my colleagues to present research, discuss our teaching and issues facing Jewish studies on the contemporary college campus. I first attended a WJSA conference in 2012 at the University of Oregon as a graduate student, and I know that it was instrumental in building my confidence to help me get to where I am today. I want to recognize the founding president, Lori Barron, who's here today, and our current president, Seth Ward, Denver Zone Seth Ward, and Amy Shevitz. So thank you. So for those of you attending your first RMJHS event tonight, just briefly, what is the Rocky Mountain Jewish Historical Society? Well, we are, of course, an integral part of the Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Denver. Our mission is to preserve and promote Jewish history in Denver, across Colorado, and throughout the Rocky Mountain region. We seek a deeper and richer understanding of the American Jewish experience, and we do this through our book clubs, our tours of Jewish communities in places like Leadville and Trinidad, Colorado, and hopefully next year in New Mexico, our annual Heritage Awards program, which I'll say more about at the close of our evening, and our new project in development, the Digital Encyclopedia of Colorado Jewish Communities, with generous support from the Rose Foundation and community donors. This is an interactive website with maps, photos, timelines, articles covering the history of every Jewish community in the state of Colorado. And if you'd like to talk to me about how to help make that happen, see me at the end of tonight's program. And of course, our annual Livingston Abrams Lecture in American Jewish History is a part of our program calendar that we look forward to every year. Many of us feel like the world at the moment we are living in now is dramatically different, maybe even frighteningly different, than the world we knew only a few years ago. We live in an age of polarization, demonization, even AI-ification. Fortunately, college campuses have remained relatively immune to these social and political winds of change. That was a laugh line. That was a joke. It didn't work. At the same time, thank you for that. Remember when Jed Bush said, "Please clap"? That's how I feel right now. At the same time, change is the only constant, and history as a discipline is the study of change over time. And not all change is bad. So tonight we're here to ask, how is American Jewish life different today than it was 25 years ago? How and why is the American Jewish community changing? What might these changes lead to? And here to tell us all about it, we have assembled an all-star panel of scholars. So let me begin by introducing the editor of the book that inspired tonight's program, Frederick Greenspahn. So Frederick Greenspahn is the Gimmelstab Eminent Scholar in Judaic Studies Emeritus at Florida Atlantic University, and of course, a former professor of religion and Judaic Studies right here at DU, where he taught for many years. Fred, welcome home. So nice to have you back. Professor Greenspahn has written or edited 18 books, including When Brothers Dwell Together, The Preeminence of Younger Siblings in the Hebrew Bible, and Judaism and the Bible. He is a former president of the National Association of Professors of Hebrew, and he was for 5 years the editor of its journal, Hebrew Studies. He is also the series editor for NYU Press of Jewish Studies in the 21st Century, under which the book we are discussing this evening, The State of American Jewry, was published in 2025. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Greenspahn.
Thank you for the kind introduction. As Professor Furman alluded to, I taught at DU for 25 years and was able to work with and learn from John Livingston and subsequently Jeannie Abrams, so I'm a proud beneficiary of all that they offered. What I want to do in this volume is a continuation of a series I began when I left for Florida, and that was to try to find a way to share the knowledge and the insights of Jewish studies with a broader Jewish community. And so this book is the sixth of that series. What I'm going to do today is simply go over the other chapters that are in the book and the authors that they brought in, and then allow these speakers to describe their own work. And in doing so, think, if you would please, about the history of American Jewry, because the American Jewish community that we are familiar with existed largely from 1880 all the way to 1974. It was during that period that there was a mass migration, mostly from Eastern Europe. It was that period during which the organizations that we're all familiar with took shape. And yet, since that day, subsequent to the 1970s, everything has changed dramatically. And I'd like to stress the fact that change is not always good, not always bad. But rather, the Jewish community we have today is quite different from the one that existed for half a century. Just to look around this particular city, I would point out that the Denver Jewish community is far more dispersed in this metropolitan area than it was before. And the best example I can give is a comment that somebody made to me a couple years ago about the JCC, because it is no longer located right in the center where all the other Jews live. Similarly, many of the other organizations, the synagogues, the schools, have changed in a variety of ways. And what I'm going to try to do in my time this evening is simply describe the changes that are elucidated in the book that are not covered by the speakers who are here this evening. So I intend to go through 4 of those, and they were all contributed, as these 4 are, by experts in their own respective fields. As I said before, my field is Bible, so we don't deal with the changes that took place there, but I also have a career as an editor, and I've done a lot of that over the years. So what are the 4 changes that I would draw your attention to? First is that American Jewish life has become what one scholar, Mark Dollinger, called liminal. What does he mean by that? He says, first, we have become financially successful, but not always nor all Jews, as pointed out by Ilana Horwitz in her chapter. And as Dollinger points out, there are good parts and bad parts to what's taken place. For example, if you'd like to see an example of American Jewish success, all you have to do is look at the speakers that Donald Trump speaks about. Howard Lutnick, Jared Kushner, Stephen Witkoff. They're all Jewish, and they all work for Donald Trump. On the other hand, as we experienced just the last few weeks, but had seen before, there's been a growing amount and very visible forms of anti-Semitism over the last 10 to 20 years. So we are both tremendously successful and tremendously at risk, all at the same time. Secondly, there's been a dramatic change in the population of the American Jewish community. First, because of migration. All Jews in America didn't come from Eastern Europe. Stephen Gold categorized that. He pointed to the fact that there are a large number of Latino Jews who have come here, a large number of Israeli Jews who have moved here, and a large number of Russian Jews who have moved here. So we have groups that are much more recent than the end of the 19th century. Secondly, in the same area, we have changed racially. Notably, there are now a large number of black Jews in the Jewish community, as categorized by Bruce Haynes, who teaches at University of California in Davis. In fact, I would draw your attention to the fact that, to the best of my knowledge, the first black rabbi actually spent a lot of her time here in Denver, Colorado, albeit before she became a rabbi. Her name is Alyssa Stanton. Another black rabbi, who's very well known, is named Capers Fournier. You may or may not be familiar with her, but it might help to know that she's Michelle Obama's cousin. He grew up in Chicago. He was part of the black Israelite community where he served as a rabbi, and then was converted, in quotes, by a conservative rabbi in Chicago to make sure that he'd be accepted by all the other Jews that lived in that area. At the same time, we have several prominent Asian Jews now in the Jewish community, including most notably what is probably the most prominent most prominent rabbi, frankly, today. She is part Korean. Her name is Angela Buchdahl, and you may have encountered her name. The president of the Association for Jewish Studies also is at least partially Korean. Her name is Helen Kim. So we are not all from Poland and Ukraine and places like that, and we do not all look the same. Thirdly, we've changed with regard to religion, and that took two contributions, one from Ari Kelman at Stanford, and the other from Zev Elif, who teaches at Gretz College in Philadelphia. Ari Kelman pointed out that a lot of non-Orthodox Jews, who may belong to synagogues or not, are actually more culturally Jewish than they are religiously Jewish. And so if you go even to synagogues now, oftentimes you will notice music that's very different from what we were used to, including if you stop at synagogues in Denver, Colorado. They sometimes play the guitar. They have small music singing groups and playing groups. The congregation is encouraged to sing and to dance among their congregants. Indeed, you can go to one large Reform congregation here and many around the country that don't have prayer books anymore. This is the largest congregation in Denver, Colorado, and one of the two oldest congregations. They don't have prayer books. Instead, they have slides that are put up on a screen so everybody can look at them and sing along. Notice, sing, not read. I think I could mention that they got that idea from evangelicals who came up with the idea of not using prayer books, but having signs that they could sing along with. On the other side, there are Orthodox Jews, and Zev Elif points out that they come in a variety of different versions. So there are modern Orthodox Jews, the sort you would find at Yeshiva University, for example. There are ultra-Orthodox Jews of various types. Oftentimes they don't get along very well with each other. There are Chabad Jews who find themselves in various settings, including one at the University of Denver. And finally, I should add, as one magazine pointed out, there's something a friend of mine pointed out called social Orthodox Jews who live in a very different form. Finally, organizations. And for this, I refer to Ted Sasson, a professor on the East Coast. Over the past several decades, we have seen several changes and particularly weakening of Jewish organizations. So, for example, the mainstream seminaries, the Hebrew Union College, the Jewish Theological Seminary, Yeshiva University are all weaker in their seminaries than they once were. In Denver, Colorado, the Federation, now called Jewish Colorado, is much weaker. Jewish Family Service which used to serve various Jewish families, are much weaker than they were. And then there are organizations that no longer even exist: the Central Agency for Jewish Education, the Denver Institute for Jewish Studies, the Center for Jewish Studies at local Christian seminaries. Part of what they did at the Center for Judaic Studies here was teach at 3 local Christian seminaries. All of that has gone away. At the same time, however, there are a lot of new and growing organizations. So for example, if you look around the Hilltop Winston Downs area, you'll see lots of Orthodox Jews who do not belong necessarily to EDOS or to BMH. Meanwhile, BMH and Beth Joseph, which were 2 separate congregations, have merged and are now about 1/3 or 1/4 of the size of what they once were, and are reevaluating what their approach to being Orthodox is going to be. But it's certainly going to be different from what it was during the 25 years I taught at DU. Denver has instead a large organization you may have encountered called the Judaism Your Way. It's a remarkable name for a religious organization, Do It Your Way. But it's huge, as you all may know. And then the seminaries. There are several seminaries now that produce women rabbis, including Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, and yes, Orthodox. At the same time, some of those established seminaries have shrunk. So for example, the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati is gone, and it has turned its program in LA to a full program. Ziegler in LA has replaced JTS as one of the center places. And then there are lots of new seminaries that are not denominational. So for example, there's the Academy for Jewish Religion, which has 2 branches, one on the West Coast and one on the East. Aleph, here in Boulder. Hadar, Shalom Hartman Institute, Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, which is Orthodox for men, and Yeshivat Maharat, which is Orthodox for women rabbis. College campuses has Hillel, but it also has Chabad to compete with each other. And now there's an organization called Open Hillel, or rather it was called Open Hillel until Hillel wanted to copyright the name, so it's now called Judaism in Our Own Terms. As far as Israel is concerned, we have the Zionist Organization of America and AIPAC, those are on the right. We have J Street, which is much more central, and we have the Jewish Voice for Peace, which is far to the left. And yes, they all exist here in Denver as well as everywhere else in the country. And if you go to the Jewish campuses, you will find Stand For Us, a right-wing pro-Israel organization, and if not now, a left-wing pro-Israel organization. You can see the same thing, by the way, in Israel. As far as the creation of other organizations, let me just list the names and then I'll be done. There's Truah, which engages in social justice. Moshe House, a place where 20-somethings can live together or work together. Birthright, you may remember, leading trips to Israel. Repair the World. Svara, which was for gender fluid groups. 18 Doors for intermarried groups. The American Jewish World Service, which tries to help Jews elsewhere. Respectability for disabled Jews. Chazon, Mazan, Wilderness Torah, and Romemu. You know, there's lots of organizations that are flourishing, even as the established ones are weakening. So that's my overview of the various topics that are not going to be discussed today. We now turn our attention to the other speakers. Our first speaker will be Sarah Imhoff, who will speak about the role of gender in the Jewish community.
Good evening. I am, by training, a historian, so I feel right at home here in giving a lecture that is in part about history, but in part about what's new about the time that we live in. So thanks for joining us tonight. I'm going to be a classic academic here, and I'm going to tell you my thesis right up front. And that is that some of the most interesting and wide-reaching changes in American Judaism in the last couple of decades involve gender. If you want to look for many of the things that Fred mentioned, you're going to find aspects of gender as part of them, and you may even find aspects of gender as driving those changes. It is, of course, not the only thing. The book has many chapters for a good reason, but I'm going to mention a few of these here so we can see the wide range of developments that are attached to and influenced by and driven by changes in gender in the American Jewish community. So I'll mention 4 things in my brief time. One of them is religious participation. The second one is rabbis and the rabbinate. The third is non-institutional spaces, or which Fred called some of these institutions, but I think of many of them as more grassroots or communal spaces. And the last one is politics and text. So in the past 25 years, Orthodox Jews in the US have fought over whether women could be rabbis. And in fact, we now have multiple branches of Orthodoxy that call themselves by different names specifically over this issue. The conservative movement's rabbinical assembly issued a resolution affirming transgender and gender nonconforming Jews as full participants in Jewish life, but not after quite a long discussion. It was after quite a long discussion. And Jews from all religious affiliations, including none at all, have reassessed what a good and healthy masculinity should look like in the wake of Me Too. These are just a few quick examples, but gender, it is fair to say, matters to American Jews. Demographically, Jews in the US, yes, often mirror other Americans with respect to gender. For example, Jewish women in the US participate in Jewish activities, including synagogue attendance, at a higher rate than men do. Similarly, in the Christian world, church ladies are a well-known demographic in a way that we don't really talk about church men. This is true for lots of American Jews, too. Across these religious affiliations, of people who attend services at least once a week, 57% are women and 42% are men. Yet, of course, there's a twist. Orthodox men are more likely to attend services frequently than Orthodox women are. Even though women are more likely to be joiners or participants in other Jewish activities, when it comes to synagogue services, the numbers for men and women are almost equal. 20% of men and 19% of women attend weekly or more frequently. And perhaps this is in part because in most Orthodox services, though not all, theologies and practices place a greater importance on men's public participation than on women's. And again, although interpretations vary, for example, most count only adult men in a prayer quorum, and most have only men read publicly from the Torah. Even the physical spaces reflect the importance of gender in religious practice. Many Orthodox religious spaces use a mechitza, or a divider between men and women, as you know, and Hasidic, Haredi, or other ultra-Orthodox spaces will sometimes even use a balcony and reserve the main area for men. Most of my talk here is about the larger demographic in the US, which is not these Hasidic, Haredi, or other ultra-Orthodox spaces, although demographically those are growing, and we can see important and interesting changes with respect to gender in those communities too. Reform, Reconstructionist, and conservative services and theologies more commonly provide equal opportunities and expectations of people of different genders, although this doesn't always mean they're identical. So when we observe these things, just the ones I've quickly mentioned here, Jewish women's greater participation in social and religious organizations in general, as well as the particular theological dynamics that are quite different across these groups, and ones that privilege men's participation in a public way in Orthodox Judaism, we already get a sense that if we want to think well about gender and Jewish communities, we should both be asking, what is it that Jews share with others around them, and what's distinctive in distinctive Jewish contexts? We should also ask, what's shared across communities of Jews, and what's different in different local Jewish communities or different denominational Jewish communities. Okay, so I'll briefly talk here about the changing face of the rabbinate, and this is important for not just who is a rabbi, but how many Jews experience Judaism. Rabbis and cantors occupy perhaps the most visible form of Jewish leadership, and these positions have undergone substantial gendered changes in the past several decades. The first woman to be ordained regularly in the US as a rabbi was Sally Priesand in 1972. By the way, that means most people who are becoming rabbis today, if they're in a liberal denomination, don't remember a world in which there were no women rabbis. In the half century since 1972, many Jewish communities have moved from a landscape of women's opportunity that the historian Shuli Rubin Schwartz described. She wrote an article on Rebbitzins, or rabbis' wives, and so she says they married what they wanted to be. We've moved from a situation where that's the option for women's Jewish religious leadership to a situation where women make up more than half of newly ordained non-Orthodox rabbis in the US each year. A study from just a few months ago found that of new rabbinical school grads, 58% identify as women, 30% as men, and 12% as non-binary. Among all working rabbis, so this includes Orthodox rabbis, now 39% are women. And if we look at only non-Orthodox rabbis, 46%. So these are really significant changes. The increasing number and percentage of rabbis has also reshaped both the position of the rabbi as well as the dynamics between the rabbi and lay people. The gender of leaders shapes how they lead. We know this from many, many studies. It also influences how congregants and others respond to them. Increasing gender diversity in Jewish religious leadership has corresponded with changes in Jewish religious life. In one early study of women rabbis, almost all of them said they carry out the rabbinical role differently from their male colleagues. They saw themselves as, quote, less formal, more approachable, more egalitarian. They said they were less invested in their own prominence and more committed to having people interpret and experience rituals through their own perspectives. Rabbi Laura Geller asserts that this change has changed the face of American Judaism. Women rabbis' success, she says, has led to a breakdown of a traditional hierarchy between rabbis and congregation. It has led to a more inclusive Judaism. So this is really interesting. She's saying, well, we can track the numbers of more women rabbis, but we should also be noting the qualitative experience that people are having that is quite different. She also emphasizes that leadership models have changed, in part in response to this, moving more toward what she describes as partnership instead of hierarchy, empowerment instead of power over, and the presence of women rabbis has changed the culture and structure of synagogues and other Jewish institutions to become more participatory and less focused on one leader. So that gives you a brief sense of how looking at the rabbinate and the increasing number of women rabbis really does give us a sense of how American Judaism, as it's practiced and experienced by many Jews, has developed over the last couple of decades. I'm going to talk briefly about what I decided to call non-institutional spaces. So discussing the gendered landscape of American Judaism requires looking into a variety of locations, including beyond synagogues. Interestingly, more and more rabbis, in fact, are even working in places that are not synagogues. Almost half now of people employed as rabbis are working in other spaces, so think like campus spaces, chaplaincy, other kinds of Jewish organizations too. Many Jews think of themselves as religious or spiritual, but they do religious practices at home or in other spaces. There's a temptation sometimes to call a lot of people secular Jews, but as a religious studies scholar, I want to say if you are practicing Passover in your home, there is something that is religious about your practice. So Passover Seders are a great example. This is the most commonly practiced ritual for US Jews, including by a lot of people who don't otherwise label themselves as religious Jews. There are also other things that are going on. Fred mentioned some of them. Study groups, whether they're institutional ones like Svara, which is a queer yeshiva, which does a lot of online stuff as well as some in-person stuff. There are some structured but also do-it-yourself things like Daf Yomi, which is the page a day reading the Talmud. And there are also informal partnerships and informal study groups. Over the past couple of decades, all of these have grown in popularity and begun to expand what was the typically male enterprise of studying Talmud. And as we can see, as the expansion of Talmud studies suggest, ideas about gender underpin many aspects of Jewish life. And these aspects are not just the ones that affect women. Historians, when they think about gender, often attend to women's changing gender roles. But we also know that men's gender roles have changed too, especially following prominent instances of sexual assault and the Me Too movement, including Jewish men as some of the perpetrators. Questions about male expressions of power, dominance, and sexuality have animated Jewish conversations about the ethics and the ideals of what it means to be a Jewish man. In the last 5 or 6 years, we've seen examples of programming aimed at discussing healthy masculinity or raising good Jewish men aimed at parents. We've seen these in summer camps, in synagogues, at Hillels, at JCCs. Another significant development has been the visibility of trans, genderqueer, and non-binary members of Jewish communities. Trans people are those who don't identify with the gender they were assigned at birth. So while all branches of Judaism have trans or non-binary Jews, both the social and halakhic approaches to their inclusion or their exclusion differ across these groups. There's an often cited passage from the Babylonian Talmud that discusses the androgynos, a category of a person with dual genitalia. There's not a really good English translation for this because it's not actually a gender category we have today. In spite of the things that want to tell you the 9 genders of the Talmud, there is not a one-to-one correspondence between the genders as described in the Talmud and the genders that we live with today. But this one is a very popular text to appeal to show that Jewish tradition has in fact thought about gender in ways that are more expansive than just men and just women. So this passage goes, an androgynos is in some ways equivalent to men, in some ways equivalent to women, is in some ways equivalent to both men and women, and it is in some ways not equivalent to either men or women. The androgynos and the tumtum, which is another Talmudic category for a person who does not fit the gender binary clearly, appear in rabbinic texts. They usually appear as legal questions. So they're usually appearing as legal halakhic questions. What is this person required to do? Are they required to do this thing like a man would be required to do it, or are they required to do it like a woman would be required to do it? Which is often how the conversation goes. Their gender is under discussion, but their belonging in the community is not. Scholar Max Strassfeld explains that although there's not a one-to-one equivalence of the rabbinic androgynos and the trans person today, contemporary readings still do present meaningful articulations of what kinds of gendered bodies get recognized as human bodies. As the trans rabbi, Rabbi Elliot Kukla puts it, Jewish gender diversity provides anyone who can't or won't conform to modern binary gender a solid connection to another time, space, and community, a spiritual home. So you can see in these articulations that the rabbinic text's inclusion of a diversity of sexed bodies authorizes for the speakers or even demands that contemporary Jews do the same, as in make space for those who have gendered bodies that don't match a binary. Orthodox Jewish opinions on gender tend to uphold a gender binary in which there's a bright line between male and female, and those who don't easily fit on one side or the other are often seen as a medical problem or as someone who is in need of help. Although some individual rabbis do differ on opinions, most Orthodox institutions don't see a halakhic space for trans Jews. Liberal Jews, on the other hand, often point to the Talmudic categories that I've mentioned, of sexes beyond male and female, to celebrate the progressiveness of Judaism. In fact, sometimes they even celebrate Judaism as more progressive than other religions or cultures because, look, our text talks about people who don't fit the gender binary. And yet, non-binary and genderqueer people often still face discrimination or confusion about their presence in Jewish spaces. So this has been a really quick tour of American Judaism and the wide-reaching ways we can see gender changing and also reflecting changes in the religious landscape. I've briefly talked about religious participation, the rabbinate, these non-institutional spaces, and the relationship of gender and texts and politics. And there's always more we could talk about, so I'm going to turn it over to our next speaker.
Can you? No, you can't. Now can you hear me? Okay, I will yell. Our next speaker is Jennifer Thompson, who will be speaking about non-Jews in the Jewish community.
Why is it not working? Uh-oh. It worked a minute ago. Did it go to sleep? Who knows something about these? Maybe you'll get to see them. I hope so, because some of the information is on there. So let's see. Let's start by visualizing a scene together, briefly. On a Sabbath morning, proud parents are standing together in their synagogue, listening to their child read from the Torah for the first time as he becomes bar mitzvah. Is that better? Family and friends sit in the congregation. Regular members of the congregation are also participating. Non-Jews could be almost anywhere in this scenario, sitting among friends and family in the pews, still not working, standing as a parent on the bima, participating as family members, or attending as a congregation member in the process of converting to Judaism. Some of these non-Jews may be in a synagogue for the first time, and others might be intimately familiar through raising their children as Jews. Yeah. Some of them may actually be Jews who are nevertheless considered non-Jews in certain other settings because they had a non-Orthodox conversion or were born to a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother. When we talk about non-Jews in Jewish communities, we need to start by recognizing the many reasons and ways they can be present. So, do we have another option? Okay. All right. Some of the reasons and ways that they can be present in Jewish communities then could be participating in Yiddish cultural programs, academic Jewish studies as students or scholars, marrying into a Jewish family as a relative of somebody who marries into a Jewish family, biological parent of a child adopted into a Jewish family. Oh, that is looking better. That's not the right one, but let's go back. Okay, let's. I'm so sorry. Thank you. All right, so much for dress rehearsal. Here's the list. Guest at ritual occasions, friends, family, whatever, interfaith study and programming, discovery of Jewish heritage through DNA analysis, like 23andMe or what have you. Jewish communities don't typically have any issues with non-Jews who are just stopping by. It's those who are integrated into the community who are provoking questions about inclusion and boundaries. The non-Jews are not the ones raising these questions. They typically go along with whatever the community has decided. It's the Jewish spouses and parents, rabbis, and synagogue leadership who have the questions. Oh, good. So how often are non-Jews part of Jewish families and communities? Pretty often, whether as friends or family members. I'm showing the percent of converts here not to imply that they are non-Jews, but because their non-Jewish family members often become connected to the Jewish community in some way. Those who have converted or who have mixed ancestry, meaning a Jewish parent and non-Jewish parent, may experience liminality, a sense of being part of the community while not being fully accepted. Liminality is a state of being betwixt and between, in this case, both Jewish and not Jewish at the same time. It applies here in two ways. There's a liminality imposed on Jews of patrilineal descent and on non-Orthodox converts in that some communities question or don't recognize their Jewishness, even though they're fully Jewish in liberal Jewish communities. There's also a more literal kind of liminality for people who are not Jewish and yet are integrated into the Jewish community. I'm thinking here in particular of non-Jewish wives of Jewish men who are raising Jewish children. Not every interfaith family configures its religious life in this way, but this kind of case study shows us how important non-Jews can be in Jewish communities. Sometimes their kids undergo conversion. Sometimes the mothers eventually do too, although typically the conversion is not Orthodox, so the same conditional Jewishness applies to them either way. But in my ethnographic research, I've heard over and over about Jewish husbands who insisted on having Jewish children, but resisted engaging in Jewish communal life to support that goal. It was their wives who pushed to join synagogues and enroll the children in religious school. It was their wives who did the home-based religious labor of making Shabbat and holidays. They would say, if we're going to raise our children as Jews, we're going to do it right. And I asked one woman why her husband didn't perform this work. Since he was the one who was Jewish, her answer was, he wouldn't know anything. But she wouldn't have known anything either, except that she did all this work to learn. I've argued elsewhere that non-Jewish women like these function as religious leaders in Jewish homes. Their labor is what shapes the children into Jews over the course of their childhoods. And they weren't only doing it for their husband's sake. Many of them were eager to help preserve Jewish tradition and heritage, and felt honored to help increase the number of Jews in the wake of the Holocaust. Some did resent being asked to give up celebrating Christmas in their homes, and some did find their Jewish in-laws unwelcoming. They were all clear about the women's identities as non-Jews. The share of Jews with interfaith backgrounds is growing. About half of millennial, Gen Z, and Gen Alpha Jews have non-Jewish family members. This raises a kind of existential question about what do we even mean if we talk about the center of the Jewish community versus the periphery. A 46% share of the population is in no way peripheral. Their liminality is created by discourses about Jewish communal boundaries rather than by practice. Synagogues have been adapting their practices and policies to recognize that non-Jews are indeed part of their communities. They've had to address questions about who may belong to a Jewish community and under what conditions. Synagogue bylaws are one place where we can see these adaptations. Some synagogues don't allow non-Jews to be members. Those that do allow it have to work out questions about how non-Jews can be members. Can they serve in leadership positions? Can a non-Jew be president of the synagogue, chair of the ritual committee? Ritual practices are also adapting. Intermarried Jews often advocate to include their non-Jewish spouses in B'nai Mitzvah rituals where parents are typically involved. Rabbis don't want to have non-Jews performing rituals meant for Jews, so some synagogues include non-Jewish family by having them do readings in English that are extraneous to the service, or they have blessings for non-Jewish family members or rituals of passing a talit or a Torah. Typically, the boundary is that the non-Jews cannot lead or participate in rituals that only Jews are obligated to do or that represent them as part of the Jewish covenant with God. Along with ritual innovations, some rabbis have grasped for more appropriate terminology than non-Jew. It seems unfair to put someone who's raising a Jewish child in the same category with someone who doesn't know any Jews or anything about Judaism. No specific name is caught on widely yet, but here are some examples. The biblical concept of a non-Jew who resides with the Jewish community, ger toshav, has been suggested by numerous rabbis. Rabbi Amichai Lau Levi has suggested joy, a title invented by his non-Jewish friend, I see you all have read it, who said, I am a Jew who's also a goy, goy meaning non-Jew. Rabbi Gila Razel Raphael suggested the term fellow traveler, and you can see from the dates that this effort has been going on for a long time. Kind of a long time for no one to have settled on what the word should be yet, but here we are. Some rabbis are also creating blessings that recognize contributions of non-Jews. In 2004, the Washington Post covered Rabbi Janet Martyr's blessing for non-Jews in her congregation on Yom Kippur, thanking them for being part of the congregation, supporting their Jewish partners, and raising Jewish children. This blessing was picked up by other Reform synagogues. One non-Jewish man who's an active part of his family's synagogue life commented on the blessing, quote, "It was awesome. It kind of gave you goosebumps. Not anything had happened like this before." Rabbi Tova Spitzer's congregation Dorshei Tzedek in West Newton, Massachusetts, has a blessing for non-Jews to recite before a Torah reading. "Blessed is the source of life, who has brought me into a loving relationship with the Jewish people and the Torah. Blessed is the source of the Torah." And that would be followed by a Jewish person reciting the standard blessing. The point of this chapter in the book is to draw attention to the ways non-Jews are already part of many Jewish communities. The political scientists Robert Putnam and David Campbell tell us that this kind of development is good for our society. Regular, sustained, and positive contact across religious lines improves religious tolerance and acceptance. They write, quote, "When birds of different feathers flock together, they come to trust one another," end quote. And in a time when most Jews are deeply concerned about rising anti-Semitism, realizing that they're allies that we hadn't thought about can only be a good thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Our third speaker is Dov Waxman, who will be talking about the relationship with Israel.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Good. Okay, good evening. Before I begin, I want to thank the organizers of this conference for all of their hard work in making it possible. There's a lot of work that goes into this, and I'm very grateful to them for all of that effort and the staff here this evening. And I also want to thank Fred Greenspahn for editing this book. There's a lot of hard work that goes into editing a book. It's really a labor of love. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to have a chapter in this book, which I encourage you all to read. I won't try and give you a blow-by-blow account of the entire chapter. I'm going to focus on some of the big points. To begin with, I want to emphasize what has been, I think, the theme running through all of the presentations you've heard so far this evening, which is change. And it's important at the outset to recognize that when it comes to how American Jews relate to Israel, and when it comes to their relationship with Israel, it has never been static. It has constantly changed. Many times people believe, particularly people outside of the American Jewish community, believe that American Jews have always supported Israel, that Israel has always been central to the American Jewish community has always been a central focus of American Jewish politics and public life. But in fact, that hasn't always been the case. In Israel's early years, American Jews weren't particularly focused on Israel. They were more focused on their domestic concerns. They were more focused on making it in the United States, in upward mobility, in trying to overcome the existing barriers that discriminated against them, that prevented them from gaining full admission into American society. It wasn't really until the 1960s, and particularly after the Six-Day War in 1967, that Israel really becomes central in American Jewish life and in American Jewish politics. The kind of relationship with Israel that many of us have come to know and some take for granted didn't exist before that time, and really emerges and exists for about a decade as this high point of what some have referred to as Israelolatry, where Israel, support for Israel, in some ways becomes the new civil religion of the American Jewish community. At a time when American Jews were increasingly disagreeing when it comes to religion itself and splitting into different denominations, different synagogues, Israel becomes the kind of great unifier. Supporting Israel becomes the great unifier of the American Jewish community, and it in many ways provides a means for retaining Jewish identity and for reinforcing Jewish identity at a time when many Jews were assimilating and becoming ever more secular. That relationship, that era of American Jewish support, when across the board there was a kind of consensus on the need to support Israel and on the need to support Israeli governments in their policies, that era, I argue in my chapter, is over. The era of unconditional and uncritical American Jewish support for Israel, where support for Israel is the thing that brings American Jews together, that era has ended. And the end of that era didn't come about overnight. It has been a long and gradual process that I describe in the book. And really, this dates back, in fact, to the 1980s. So the high point, the point of real uncritical and unconditional support for Israel, where Israel was a great unifier, was relatively short-lived period, from roughly 1967 to the early 1980s, beginning with Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982, and then continuing through the years of the First Intifada. We see growing dissent, criticism, cracks emerging within the wall-to-wall support that American Jews once demonstrated toward Israel. And those cracks widened further during the 1990s, during the years of the Oslo peace process, where some groups in the American Jewish community staunchly supported the peace process and advocated land for peace, while other American Jews, particularly those who tended to be more religiously orthodox and politically conservative, opposed the Oslo peace process. And you had groups like the Zionist Organization of America coming out strongly opposing the Israeli government at the time, opposing its pursuit of the peace process. Other groups like Americans for Peace Now supporting it. And a group that was somewhat unsure of its position and was AIPAC during the 1990s. So you begin to see these cracks coming not only in terms of how American Jews think about Israel, but also in terms of their public stances and the positions that their organizations take. And that accelerates even further after the collapse of the Oslo peace process and into the last few years. The change that I'm describing is not one, as many people have seen it or believed it, where American Jews are simply walking away from Israel or distancing themselves from Israel, becoming less attached. Rather, the shift that's taken place over the last 2 decades is a shift from unconditional support to critical engagement. In other words, it wasn't that American Jews weren't attached to Israel. Surveys show that actual levels of attachment remained relatively and somewhat remarkably stable, roughly 2/3 of American Jews describing themselves as either very attached or moderately attached. Rather, the shift was how they manifested that attachment, how they expressed it. In the past, expressing it through that kind of uncritical support, the Israel right or wrong, if you like, and in more recent period, through engagement, and in many times through criticism. So the rise of criticism, the rise particularly of public criticism of Israeli government policies and actions, isn't a manifestation of alienation from Israel. It's actually a manifestation of attachment. American Jews criticizing Israel because they care about Israel, because they feel attached to it. Another shift that's taken place over the last 2 decades, in particular over the last decade, and it's as a consequence of that first shift that I've described from unconditional support to critical engagement, is the shift from Israel being a source of consensus within the American Jewish community, the thing that brought American Jews together, to the thing that drives them apart, to being the primary source of division and conflict within the American Jewish community. Many rabbis no longer willing or sometimes wary of speaking about Israel in their congregations because it can spark bitter disagreements and arguments. Family members being afraid to bring up Israel around the dinner table in case it can lead to bitter arguments and disputes. And we've seen this on issue after issue, but most particularly, of course, when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and on Israel's policies toward the Palestinians. So what was once a source of unity has become a source of division. That was very briefly the shift, the change that I described taking place in the book. And really, we saw this opening up of critical space within the American Jewish community as different groups of people, different generations adopted different views and different attitudes toward Israel. When I wrote that chapter, it was a few years before October 7th and the attack that occurred on that day. So I want to end by considering what has shifted since then. The book came out since then, but most of the contributions, I believe, were written before. And I think we are now seeing another potential shift taking place. And I'll just very briefly mention this, and happy to talk more about it in the Q&A. So in many ways, I think the October 7th attacks in southern Israel, we may look back on them as having a similar impact on the American Jewish community and on the American Jewish relationship with Israel as we do about the Six-Day War of 1967. Just as that was not only a turning point in Israeli history and in Jewish history, it was also a turning point in American Jewish history and in how American Jews related to Israel. So too, I think, October 7th will be seen in retrospect as a turning point clearly in Israel's history, in Jewish history, and in American Jewish history. And what we're seeing in the 2.5 years since then is a shift from the unity that was on evidence, I think, very palpable in the days and weeks after the October 7th attack, where across the board, no matter what their views and their disagreements were when it came to Israel's policies towards the Palestinians, there was, I think, a near universal revulsion, horror, and trauma at that attack and at the massacres and the atrocities and the hostage-taking that took place. But since then, we've seen even deeper divides grow over Israel's actions during the war in Gaza and even now over the war with Iran. And I think the shift that we may begin to see, that is just beginning to emerge, is a shift in some parts of the American Jewish community away from the critical engagement that I described toward disengagement, toward avoiding the issue altogether, stepping away for one reason or another, and I won't speculate on that now, but a kind of process of disengagement and alienation. That is the first shift, that I think the first potential change we're seeing emerge. The other is a shift from the conflict and divisions that I described just a moment ago to a fracturing where instead of arguing about Israel within congregations and within families, instead of that, people are fracturing over it, separating altogether, and increasingly forming their own kind of self-enclosed, self-contained communities of like-minded people. And if that trend, as I see it, continues, I think in the future, when we talk about the American Jewish community, we will really no longer be talking about a single American Jewish community any longer, but rather about American Jewish communities, plural. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to our 4 presenters. We're going to move now to the audience Q&A portion of the evening. And what we have is we have 2 microphone stands, one where I am and one where my colleague Adam Rovner are. And if you have a question for any of our panelists, I would ask you to begin to form a line as you are able behind either one of us. I will make just a very general statement to this audience that all questions are welcome. Personal and political statements are not welcome. Okay, so thank you for honoring that rule. And as you formulate your questions and as you begin to make your way to the microphone stands, I will take the privilege of asking the first question of our panelists, who I just want to quickly introduce again. So Jennifer Thompson is a professor at California State University Northridge, Sarah Imhoff at Indiana University, and Dov Waxman, of course, at UCLA. And so my question for the 4 of you is to reflect on the role of technology in really furthering and driving a lot of the changes that you've described tonight, whether the American Jewish relationship to Israel and the way that news about what is happening in Israel and Gaza is shared and captured and disseminated, or the availability of, as I think both Sarah and Jennifer mentioned, of Jewish texts via apps and websites. So if you would just start by thinking about how technology has informed and influenced a lot of the changes you've described.
Okay, I'll just start with that. Yeah, I'm not a technological determinist, but I think it plays an essential role in explaining the shifts in how American Jews relate to Israel. If you think back to the 1950s, 1960s, it would take weeks for a copy of the Jerusalem Post to reach the United States. You really had to be really a die-hard, devoted Zionist to really follow news from Israel. Most people didn't, because it wasn't reported on in mainstream American media, and it was very hard to get access to Israeli media, but you had to read Hebrew for one thing. So one of the reasons why American Jews have critically engaged with Israel over the last few decades has been the fact that they've follow what's happening in Israel much more. The availability of English language news sources, particularly thanks to the internet, has meant that they've gotten to know Israel much better. It's not just this kind of mythic land of their imagination, even if they haven't been there in person, but of course technology is also about cheaper airplane travel, the ability to actually go to Israel. Growing numbers of American Jews have actually visited. So one of the key underlying reasons for why American Jews have ironically become more critical of Israel is because they've gotten to know it better. They've gotten to know, and that means they dislike certain things that disagree with their own politics or values. One of the shifts, again, technology driving today, is the shift from kind of what you might call mass media to narrow media. That is, you can choose your own news sources to reinforce your own political orientations. And increasingly for younger generation, they're consuming their news and information online, whether it's through TikTok or, primarily TikTok or whatever other platform they happen to be on. That means, for example, many of my students, including young Jews, what they witnessed during the war in Gaza may have been completely different to what many of you witnessed during the war in Gaza. So depending on the news sources, depending on the technology you have access to, particularly if you're using social media as the primary means to consume your news, that has a profound impact, not just upon how American Jews relate to Israel, but on how they see the world at large, how they understand anti-Semitism, how they understand Jewish identity. So yeah, technology is one of the constant driving forces of change in how American Jews relate to Israel and in how American Jews understand themselves.
Yeah, I could give a lot of examples. I'll give one short one, which is technology has been really essential for LGBTQ Jews to find one another and feel belonging in Jewish communities. So lots of people will say, well, LGBTQ, if you are, say, genderqueer, you are part of a minority that is not necessarily represented in your family of origin, maybe not other places in your immediate community if you live in certain kinds of communities. And so online spaces in particular, like Sfara and like others, have helped Jews who don't see themselves within the gender binary to really feel themselves to be part of the Jewish community in ways that previously you would have had to live in one of a few cities to feel like you really belonged as both, say, a gay person and a Jewish person. And now we live in a world where that's quite possible. So lots of examples, but that's an interesting one, I think.
Something similar, I think, for my case. My current research project, I'm studying what people mean when they call themselves bad Jews. And technology, specifically social media, is the way into this for me, and this is related, I promise, because people find each other in the same way, and not only do they find each other, but they realize that actually there's a ton of people with their same set of experiences. A lot of it does revolve around intermarriage or being someone of patrilineal descent, and deciding that people are going to call me a bad Jew. Nobody ever really did this, it's in their mind, but, and it's okay, and I can be a bad Jew and I'm still a Jew. Without social media creating this community where people find each other primarily via hashtags that they use back and forth, I don't know that it would have developed, at least not as quickly as it has.
First question from you.
Do you want to?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, Gregory Brown, University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And my question is Professor Waxman. The central assertion, I have to confess I have not read the chapter, so you may just want to tell me to read the chapter. The central assertion, though, is a change in opinion or a fracturing of opinion. And I'm wondering how you measure that. In particular, I'm wondering, because your examples in the talk were mostly public statements or references to public statements, and it could be surveys. There's a sort of specialized field of doing public opinion around Jewish American opinion, which is not always reflected in what gets published in major media polls. But I'm thinking about probably the single most important thing, which is philanthropic, charitable, and private investment, right? Which has never been higher. I mean, much, much higher now than it was before October 7th, and much, much, much higher now than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. So I wonder if you have thoughts on that. And then the flip side to that is dynamics within Israeli society and politics, right? Because the period you talked about as being a period of consensus primarily was also a political consensus within Israel, right? It was fundamentally one political party. And I wonder the extent to which what may be reflected in your assertion is also characteristic of Israeli public opinion if you're talking about specifically government policies.
Yeah, so data, I've drawn a wealth of data. I mean, what I was providing this evening was obviously a very brief synopsis. I wrote a book called Trouble in the Tribe, which documents this in much more extensive detail. Primarily survey data, so there's extensive, it's quite, there's extensive survey data on how American Jews relate to Israel. A lot of it looks at attachment to Israel rather than political attitudes. But one of the things that survey data does show, and I particularly rely upon the Pew surveys, is the increasing viewpoint that you don't have to agree or support the policies of Israeli government to be pro-Israel. Right, that view becoming increasingly now it is the majority opinion, So survey data is one. Absolutely, also if you look at donations, but again, what the record that you mentioned of kind of how much money American Jews donate to Israel demonstrates is on the one hand continued attachment because they're donating money, and as you said, actually after October the 7th in not exactly record numbers, there's higher levels of donations after the Yom Kippur War in 1973, but certainly higher than after 1967. One of the things, though, that is notable about trends in philanthropy is the ways in which American Jews have increasingly shifted from giving to federations and centralized institutions to organizations that reflect their specific politics. So again, it indicates that kind of critical engagement. You know, one might want to give to the New Israel Fund, another might want to give to the Hebron Fund. Very different organizations, in case you're wondering. So looking at raw levels of monetary giving doesn't necessarily tell us the more nuanced ways in which they're giving that money. Increasingly, the shift that took place in philanthropic terms was the desire to influence Israel. So in the past, American Jews gave lots of money as a kind of way, basically, of support, demonstrating their support for Israel. It was like philanthropic Zionism. More recently, as in last decade, 2 decades, it's also about trying to shift Israel, to change Israel, to move it in the direction that they would like it to see. And as I said, that is a reflection of more critical engagement. In terms of donations post-October the 7th, as I say, on the one hand, that demonstrates that surge of solidarity in the aftermath of October the 7th. I think since then, levels have dropped. But we also have to look at not just total numbers, but the numbers of donations. In other words, not just the gross figure. And one of the things I think, and you hear this from many federation officials, is actually that less people are giving more money. And that is also shifting the politics of the organized American Jewish community, because increasingly it's a small number of major donors rather than, as it was in eras past, where it was many more donors giving small amounts. So yes, there's lots of data, and I think they do indicate, as I said, in broad terms, this attachment but critical engagement. And I also see now this shift toward supporting specific causes that reflect your specific interests. And increasingly, though, the major shift is away from Israel causes and toward anti-Semitism.
This is for Sarah. I'm really interested in Jewish feminism, and I'm sure that there's all this stuff you wanted to write about. So what is your favorite weird thing that you just couldn't include?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. Oh no. Weird thing. Now I can think of no weird things. Okay, so this is just a fun and interesting fact. It's not weird, but of the rabbinical classes that are at not only the major seminaries, but also the non-denominational ones, now more than half of rabbinical students and recent grads identify as LGBTQ. Yeah, and that's counting everybody except ultra-Orthodox, or it is also counting YCT and Yeshiva Maharat, but it's not counting REITs and ultra-Orthodox means of ordination.
My question is also for you, Sarah. The fourth thing that you wanted to discuss, I think you kind of ran out of time, was politics with gender.
Yeah.
Could you give a brief?
Yeah, so it was sneaky in there. I just wasn't super explicit about it. One of the ways that I think many liberal and progressive Jewish communities are signaling that they understand themselves to be liberal and progressive is through discourses about gender. And so that example of Judaism is more progressive than these other religions because look, the Talmud has many genders. I think this is also especially to connect to Dov here, I think this is especially dominant in the moments where liberal American Jews are feeling distance from people they have understood to be their political peers in the past, and to say, no, we are liberal and progressive. We understand that you view us as having certain kinds of attachments to Israel, and we see others who are politically liberal and progressive being critical of Israel, but no, we too are. And this is one of the ways that you can see we are. And so that relationship, that kind of calling on Jewish tradition and especially Jewish text to signal certain kinds of gender commitments is a way of signaling a set of political commitments. So thanks for asking about that. That was great.
Hey, hi, I'm Susanna Spear, and I'm a freelance journalist based in Colorado. So I'd be interested in hearing your answers in terms of how it pertains to Colorado, as well as how it pertains to the rest of the country. Any of you is welcome to weigh in and answer, because it's a hard question. If the state of American Jewry is partly reflected in how anti-Semitic violence is publicly understood, what should we make of the fact that some cases are widely covered while others are effectively avoided by major media outlets?
I want to ask you the question. If you are seeing a trend that you're asking us to respond to, because off the top of my head, I mean, I'm wondering, is there a trend that you're observing that you would like us to respond to?
I'm in the early stages of researching a reported essay about it, and it was inspired by two events in Colorado that I'm sort of looking at. Is there a trend based on those two events? I mean, I saw a huge discrepancy.
So, a discrepancy in how the media, what they covered and what they didn't cover?
Yeah. There are anti-Semitic events. I was the only reporter in the room, in the courtroom, when an anti-Semitic, the perpetrator of an anti-Semitic crime was sentenced to 10 years in prison. And it was a really violent crime. And so, yeah, I'm trying to understand why that was completely ignored, and why it's even been hard to get, to get a publisher for the article, whereas the Boulder attack was much more widely covered.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about the cases in question, but I have been writing a book about anti-Semitism in America, so I do, and I think my general thought about why some attacks and incidents. I mean, first of all, most anti-Semitic incidents, as well as other hate crimes, just don't make it into the news. I mean, there's so many that they don't tend to make it into the news in general. And there's, but in terms of what gets covered, obviously being able to get images of something makes a huge difference to the media. Being able to kind of carry out interviews. I do think in the last year or two, there's been a lot of focus on Israel-related events like the attack in Boulder and the attack in Washington, D.C. at the Jewish Museum there. And obviously there was a huge amount of media attention on the protests on college campuses. That received a kind of basically a media, especially at my university at UCLA, what could only be described as a media frenzy, whereas there was a shooting at a university in Florida carried out by a white nationalist. I don't know how many people are even aware of that. 2 people were killed. So I think in general, I would say, as a very sweeping generalization, that very often Christian white nationalist violence doesn't receive the same kind of media attention. But I'm not a media studies scholar, so I won't kind of speculate, but I think there is clearly, and I think that is true beyond anti-Semitic attacks. I mean, certainly violence against many other communities in this country barely gets reported on.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Evelyn, and this question is primarily for Dov Waxman, and I'm so certain that you're sick of me now, but I welcome anybody to answer this question, and it's going to be a long question, so once again, I apologize. My research focuses on contemporary Jewish identity formation, and what I've seen is a restructuring of this identity, and especially after October 7th, along with a growing suspicion of Jews with each other over differing beliefs over Israel. I think the mainstream idea that we were raised with, or that is still primarily promoted in many Jewish spaces as well as in mainstream media, is that most Jews will be aligned with and or supportive of Israel. In my case, this assumption and this suspicion on this campus led to a near abandonment of common spaces such as Hillel, Chabad, and other Jewish spaces. So my question then is, what advice or what can organizations hoping to create Jewish belonging and Jewish community do to mitigate or respond to this fracturing of Jewish community?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I think in order, it is absolutely necessary in order to prevent this fracturing process from taking place, to allow political pluralism, to allow dissent. There was an opening up of the critical space within the American Jewish community when it came to Israel prior to October the 7th, particularly during the months of the judicial overhaul in Israel, where you really saw even kind of very mainstream establishment organizations like the AJC and the ADL quite vocally oppose the plan to so-called overhaul or reform or the Israeli judiciary. Since October the 7th, I think there's been a closing of that critical space. I think many Jews have felt that, that is not the time to be making public their criticisms or their discomfort with Israel's policies. I think that is leading particularly younger generation of Jews to exit from these organizations and these communities. So I think it's essential really to provide that critical space, and that space in which Jews are able to discuss, debate, and have differences of opinion without being called self-hating, without being attacked, without having their Jewishness or their relationship with Israel called into question. If that doesn't happen, especially given the ability now to exit, then I think we will see that fracturing process taking place, particularly with younger Jews, who are increasingly just going to form their own communities and opt out of the organized Jewish community because they don't think it not only doesn't reflect their views, but it doesn't provide the space for them to even express them.
In addition to all that, political pluralism works best if we teach people the skills to talk about it. There are experts in peace building who hire themselves out as consultants and have fabulous blogs, and I'm happy to recommend some, who have come to my campus at my invitation to teach students how to engage in discussion, which starts with lesson number 1 is know about yourself before you engage in these conversations so that it doesn't blow up into something that nobody wanted. And I'm seeing this happen a little bit in Jewish spaces, but I think it could be happening a lot more.
Yeah, I would also say, perhaps counterintuitively, sometimes coming together and having an experience that is not talking about Israel. We know from lots of sociological studies that people who share experiences are then more open to understanding what the other person has to say. So counterintuitively, sometimes perhaps the answer is, let's do something that is not about political pluralism or about politics at all, so we can feel to be in community and in relationship to one another, and then that's the space where we can have these important conversations that Dov is pointing to.
My name is Nancy Siegel. I'm a psychology professor at California State University in Fullerton. And my question is for Jennifer. I'd like to know if you have statistics on immediate families in which Judaism and another religion are being actively practiced. The reason I say that is because I've recently discovered a family with identical twin boys who are 12, and the mother, who is Lutheran, is raising one child Lutheran, and the father is raising the other child Jewish.
Yeah, that specific configuration I have never come across.
Neither have I.
Yeah, I think that might be a unicorn. I would be happy to share with you other statistics that I don't have on hand. We can connect. But you saw the slide up there about mixed ancestry more generally, and that can mean a lot of different things. And sometimes an interfaith family will not necessarily be open about whether the non-Jewish religion is being practiced or taught in the home, at least not when they're in a Jewish space, because they are aware that there will be judgment around that, and they just don't see that as anybody's business to comment on. So I'm not even sure if there are good statistics to be had, but we can chat about that.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll take one more audience question from Mark Bosco.
Thank you, Josh. I'm the president of the Jewish Historical Society here. So my question is this, it's an obvious one. The issue is that, to me, history seems to, repeat itself, but it doesn't rhyme, as is often said. But the views of young Jews these days about Israel reminds me of the Vietnam War a great deal. And it seems to be fueled in part by two things, and maybe more, that I'd like you to comment on. One is the views of the Democratic Party these days, and it's not a political comment, it's simply support, it seems to me, mostly among younger Jews, who are the ones who seem to be most critical of what's gone on since October 7th in Israel in the Gaza war, and also to, in my view, as a somewhat Orthodox Jew, to the changes in how Judaism is practiced, and the pluralism and the liberalism in Judaism, and getting away to some extent from our traditions of what mainstream or normative Judaism is, or you call it Orthodox Judaism. Those things seem to me to combine to be practically explosive in terms of now a great deal of antipathy towards Israel that is different than, of course, what I grew up. I'm 72 years old. I mean, so I have a different view about Israel than my children do. So I'd be interested to hear your views about that.
Okay, I'll try to answer that very briefly because I know we're almost out of time. Yes, certainly I think the latter factor you pointed to, that the ways in which young Jews understand their Jewishness and their Jewish identity, partly as a result of the trends and the changes that you've heard discussed this evening, for example, like intermarriage, and the fact that many young Jews come from mixed families. That means they're often having a less kind of ethnic and particularist understanding of their Jewishness, tend to think of it much more in terms of a universal social justice oriented. That certainly, I think, does shape how they view Israel, as well as you mentioned, the kind of, the generational experiences. I mean, older generation of Jews coming of age when Israel was seen as a small country surrounded by Arab enemies, the military underdog, very different than the Israel that most young American Jews have grown up with, where it's seen as the military power in the region. So certainly those historic events, their own understanding of Judaism. And I don't think, one thing I would say I don't think is the case is the Democratic Party. If anything, this shift occurred within the Jewish community prior to the shift occurring within the Democrats. What we've seen is, first of all, the rise of kind of, we support Israel, but we disagree with its government's policies, and we want to prevent it from kind of doing things that we think are against its own best interests. That shift begins in the Jewish community. Then among Democrats in general, and Democrats saying, well, we support Israel, but we don't support the policies of its governments, and we don't support the policies of its Netanyahu governments in particular. And now we're seeing a shift taking place among Republicans as well. So I think in many ways, the kind of growth of criticism and dissent began in the American Jewish community. It didn't begin in the Democratic Party and then followed it. But certainly, most young American Jews are, surveys show, more likely to be liberal, more likely to be Democratic voters. And so certainly I think they are influenced, not so much what's happening within the Democratic Party, but on the left and the progressive left in general. And that is the shift, not toward, I think the real shift that's happening among younger Jews isn't criticism of Israeli government policies, which is not limited to younger Jews, but criticism of Zionism itself. I think the real difference and the divide that's growing isn't over what should be Israel's policies in the West Bank, for example, or in Gaza, but over the very idea of a Jewish state and whether that is inherently something that young Jews feel uncomfortable with for a whole host of reasons that I won't have time to get into. But that is, I think, the divide between a younger generation and the older generation, not whether they support Israel government policies, because you see that now really across all age groups, there's divisions.
All right, thank you for that. I want to thank, first of all, Fred Greenspahn for editing the book project that brought us all together this evening, and Jennifer, Sarah, and Dov, our panelists, and thank you all for coming. We'll see you at our next Rocky Mountain Jewish Historical Society event, which is our Heritage Awards, on Monday evening, May 18th, when we will be raising a toast and celebrating the contributions of Jewish Coloradans to the liquor and beverage industry. More on that forthcoming. And if you're coming back for day 2 of the WJSA conference, we'll see you back here in Sturm Hall at 8 a.m. Thank you all. Have a good night.